The book Pearl Harbor Betrayed was copyrighted in 2001. The author is Michael Gannon, who was a professor at one of the universities in Florida. And I think he has written a very interesting book. The book covers something that most people perhaps have not heard about, in that when the Japanese, Germans, and Italy formed a tripartite, they were out for world dominion. The Japs in the Asiatic area, and then all the Pacific, and the Germans, Russia, they were fighting Russia when I came into flight school at Pensacola, Florida in 1938. And the system has just continued since then as far as the Japanese are concerned. They started wars in 1904. They had control of Korea for a while, and then after 10 years they annexed Korea. And then they went down to 3 northern provinces in China, and they established them as a separate place and gave them a name. I'm not sure I can pronounce it right, but Muchuku. And then they went on to capture the rest of China and Hanley Island, the Spratlys, and then they realized that in order to, when they joined the tripartite, they realized that they had to do something about Pearl Harbor. They had to attack Pearl Harbor. So that was the next big thing that they were practicing and trying to work out. And Yamamoto, incidentally, was in Harvard in 1920. And then in 1925, he spent 2 years at the embassy in Washington, D.C. He was the man who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he did an excellent job. He was an outstanding person. One of the things, as an example, the Japs had their consulate right above Pearl Harbor, so they could see everything. And according to the book, they were reporting everything, all the ships and where they're stationed, to Tokyo. And Yamamoto was getting the information out there because he was not actually in the attack from Pearl Harbor. It was Admiral Naguma. And so when I went to Pensacola, as I mentioned, and then I graduated in '39 and was assigned to Utility Squadron 1. That was in San Diego. And I no sooner got there than I found out that the President Roosevelt, had ordered the Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor. He thought it was too much of a danger on the West Coast, and he didn't want the Japs coming over and shelling the West Coast. So in June '40, we moved out to Pearl Harbor, and our squadron was based on Ford Island, which is surrounded by Pearl Harbor. It was a single runway, north and south, and the BOQ, Bachelor Officers' Quarters, that I was living in was on the across the runway from where our hangar was. So that morning I was having breakfast, and I looked up and I saw all these planes. We had had mock attacks from the Marine Corps and the carrier squadrons at different times, and so I didn't pay too much attention to it until I saw them dropping bombs on the other end of Ford Island. where the PBYs, the patrol aircraft, were located. And then I knew for sure that we were in for trouble. And it was scary. We had no inkling that this was going to happen to us in Pearl Harbor. We were operating on the time period from 7 to 1 every day out there. And that's what they do in the Philippines too at that time. And so it was a real shock. I ran and got my cap and coat and went to the lobby, and there were about 4 Navy families with their kids that had come over for protection. I don't know what protection we could have given them, but they were just very scared. The mothers were. The kids didn't really know, I guess, what was happening. So I went out to my car. I had a convertible with the top down, and I drove as fast as I could because while the Jap planes weren't over me, they were down at the other end of the island. I was concerned about getting strafed. But they were so well trained that they went right to their mission. And so I stopped just as I was passing the runway, north end of the runway, because the Arizona had been blown up. And it was snowing powder pellets about as large as my finger. They had dropped a bomb, a very explosive bomb on the Arizona, and it had gone down to the powder area. And that's what was coming down my car and all around me. And there were just under 1,200 people killed when that bomb was dropped. A total number of people were killed on Oahu at that time was just double that, but half of them were killed when that one bomb went off. And so it was a terrible slaughter of things. And incidentally, if the ships had not been in harbor, it would have been worse, because the Japanese had 26 subs surrounding Pearl Harbor. They'd come over before the main attack force came over. And it was very critical that, and it was a saving thing for us to have our ships in the harbor. There were about 6 vessels that were either blown up and turned over or just damaged in some way, about 6. And they didn't bother the POL or the ship repair forces at all. And that was one of the things that later in the war, Yamamoto, when he was on a survey made of the islands, he made the comment that they had gone for the wrong targets. Because if they had gone for the POL and the ship repair, we would not have been able to repair our ships for a long time, and probably never, because of the situation. If they had done a little bit more planning, they could have captured the Hawaiian Islands right there. As a matter of fact, after the attack, the shipboard people wanted Admiral Nagoma to let them make a third attack to get the POL and the ship repair. And what that would have meant to us was that the ships, we had 2 carriers when had gone to Midway to take aircraft and pilots out to Midway, Marines, and also another carrier went on to Wake Island. Wake Island was about 2,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. And so we didn't have any carriers there. That was a blessing. We didn't get the carriers destroyed, but we did both of that those islands out there. And it was fortunate, of course, because in 1942, the Japs attacked over at Midway, and that was a blessing in disguise, I guess. And so if they had knocked out the POL and the ship repair, our ships would not have oil to use. And the only way we could get it was from tankers from the West Coast. If the Japanese had planned to take over Hawaii at that time, they could have taken us over right then, because if they had knocked out the POL and the ship repair, they could have taken us over right then, because we had an army there of about 65,000 people, and the Japanese did not bring any troops with them because they were concerned when they made the crossing of the North Pacific from the Kuril Islands, where they trained just before they came over. They were concerned about other ships sighting them. They did see one Soviet ship, but the book tells us that the Japanese were ready to blow that out of the water in case it communicated. Because when they came across the North Pacific area, they had secured all communications on the ships. And that was one of the things that CINCPAC, Admiral Kimmel asked one morning after about 5 or 6 days. He had called in Commander Layton, who was an intelligence officer, and asked him if they had had anything from the carriers. Usually they would hear the CW operation from ships like that. And Commander Layton said, no, sir, he did not. He said, and CINCPAC then said, you mean to say that they could be coming around Diamond Head right now and we wouldn't know it? And he said, yes, sir, that's true, but we would probably have sighted them in some way. Now, we had had a little bit of a warning before Pearl Harbor, not the kind we needed. The kind we needed was what Washington had. And General Marshall of the Army said he forbade the sending of the message that they got from the Japanese embassy that they'd broken. He forbade that to be sent outside of Washington. And in the congressional investigation after Pearl Harbor, he was astonished that he had said that. He said he just couldn't believe that what he said was interpreted to mean that. But during that time, Admiral Kimmel in 1941 had to go back to Washington 4 times to get any more information, any intelligence. And there was none that they gave him, even though he talked to his boss, Admiral Short, who was Chief of Naval Operations. That still was not given to him. And he had to go back to Pearl Harbor. And of course, General Short had his army up around the army bases there. And they had AA, and we had AA on our guns. The Japanese commented after the war that they were surprised how quickly the ships reacted with the AA guns. The Army was not doing very well. They didn't have, excuse me, they didn't have their guns and their ammunition together, and so there wasn't much of a help from the Army. But the Japanese admiral said that he was really impressed with the way that the ships reacted. They started firing right away. So with the understanding that we were deprived of the information that we needed to protect ourselves. Admiral Kimmel had been sending out aircraft, PBYs, which can go about 800 miles and then come back 800 miles. That was their range. And then he had a few ships. It was suggested to him that they put ships out there too, small ships, like when we bombed Tokyo. One of those small ships picked up the B-25 bombers over there after they took off of our carrier. And that was exactly what we could have done if he'd decided to do so, but he decided not to do so. And these were some of the mistakes in my mind that occurred that day. Another mistake that occurred that day was the military had allowed the Japanese to have a consulate in an area where they could look down on what was happening. There were 237 people in the consulate, and many of them had been sent over by the Japanese to get as much intelligence as they could. For your information, at that time, in Pearl Harbor, December 7, Oahu had about 161,000 people, and 37% of them were Japanese. There was a lot of Japanese there, and we had a Japanese maid, and when I finally got married in 1942, we had a Japanese maid there, and working, helping my wife in the house. And there was just a lot of Japanese there. And so we had 2 attacks on Pearl Harbor ships. One came at 7:50 in the morning. That's the one that I saw from a BOQ. And then the second one came just about 9 o'clock. And the first attack was by different types of planes, high bombers, and attack bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. Now, the Japanese had been rebuilt before they started the attack. Admiral Moto was made vice admiral, and he built 7 additional carriers. He built 2 of the biggest battleships, larger than ours. They're 18-inch guns, and ours are usually 16 or 14. And so that was something he did. And of course, they built more support ships rather, and they got more people, pilots. They trained a lot of pilots. They built a lot of planes. And that's what Yamamoto used in the Kurils to train up there. He took them up there. The Kurils are north of the main part of Japan, and he trained them for about 2 months until they were ready to go to war. And they had departed on 24 November 1941. And it was about just over 31,000 miles to Pearl Harbor from the Kurils. So there was a lot of distance covered that time. And as I mentioned, they did see this one ship, but it didn't do anything, so they didn't do anything. And so we had the attacks, and they dropped 30 torpedoes, and 20 of them hit. And then they were dropping bombs in addition to that. And they, of course, they said they didn't drop on anything on the POLs or ship repair, which is very fortunate. Over at the Air Force Base, which is a short distance east of us, they were bombing the barracks over there and other things. We were concerned about them doing that over at Fort Island, but it did not happen. Some of the mistakes that were made in that attack was that the Army had some radar out in the northwest corner of the island. And they had a policy of running it until about 7 o'clock in the morning on certain days. But this morning, the Air Force officer, Army Air Corps officer at that time, because they weren't Air Force then, the Army Air Corps officer was called and told that they saw a very large radar blip at 136 miles north of Oahu, the island where Pearl Harbor is. And if they had notified the people they were supposed to notify at that time, it would have alerted everyone, and it would have been disastrous for the Japanese, because everyone had been ready, and the Army would have been ready, but they didn't. And the reason that the officer didn't do it, he said there's some B-17s coming in from the coast. And he says it's probably those, but he didn't report to his boss about the situation. That was a terrible thing. And then there was another indication. One of the two men, subs, down at the entrance of Pearl Harbor was sighted by one of our small patrol vessels. And also a PBY that was flying too. And between the PBY and the patrol vessel, they sank it. And this was about 6 o'clock in the morning of December 7th. And so they reported it to Admiral Block, who was the admiral in charge of all of Hawaiian Islands. He was not Think Pack, who was in charge of the ships. And he delayed reporting it to Think Pack because he'd asked for confirmation. That's what both Think Pack and Admiral Block had done. They asked for confirmation, which takes time, and they wasted that time, and that would have given the fighting people more time to get to use their AA guns, get ready to use them rather. And so when he notified Admiral Kimmel, the war had already started. And he came out of his home with his pajamas on, his nightgown, and while he's standing there, he was just amazed at what was happening. He thought it was the Army Air Corps flying at first, but then when he saw the bombs dropping, he knew that. And a piece of shrapnel hit him in the chest. And the book says that he said that he was sorry that it didn't kill him, that it had been that close, but apparently they didn't tell how bad it was, but he was able to get to his office as quickly as he could as soon as he got dressed. And that was one of them, the other mistakes that they made. And there were just so many things that were happening like that. The failure of Washington to send us the intelligence, the sighting of the ships out the northwest corner and not reporting it, the submarine that they didn't believe their own officers that were reporting it. And it was just one thing after another. And like I say, they should have done something about having that consulate up there that was spying on us all the time. Well, when the Japs came over in their first attack, the lead flyer there sent out the famous Tora Tora Tora, which means that it was a surprise. And incidentally, Yamato, who was monitoring everything in Tokyo, heard that all the way to Tokyo. And of course, Admiral Naguma aboard the ships heard it. And that was, I thought, an unusual thing of communication. And we had the second attack, and then the planes went out. And I was there in the hangar. I was an incident that day, alone, because I had the duty on that Sunday. And as soon as the Jap aircraft left, about 10 o'clock, the other pilots from our squadron and other people were able to catch the small boats that they usually had to take to come over to Ford Island from the main part of the island of Oahu. And so they arrived, and at that time we received search requirements, orders to go out and search for the Pacific Fleet. Well, I had the duty, and visiting a senior officer saw me there, and he said, "You take the first plane, the JRS." The JRS is a twin-engine amphibian that we always flew from land. We used it for photography. It had a high speed of 105, which is probably the best, closest thing we can get to still photography in our operation. So that was what I was flying. I had a copilot, who was an enlisted copilot, a radioman, and 3 people in the back, sailors. And this senior officer from a neighboring squadron, VJ2, Utility Squadron 2, that was just across the Ford Island hangar, their area, he came out with our guns, 3 Springfield rifles, World War I Springfield rifles. We were given, we would have to shoot through the windows to get them, and our competition would be the Zeros with cannons. And I thought at that time, this is going to be a one-way trip. I didn't know which way the Japanese, we didn't know the way the Japanese come in. And they sent me out due north for 250 miles, which is the range of my plane, turn east 10 miles, and come back to the Oahu, to the coast in Pearl Harbor. And we didn't see a thing. I flew just under the clouds because if I saw anything, I had the idea of I would go up into the clouds and try and disappear as much as I could. But I didn't see anything. The book tells us that when the Japanese came in due south, they turned to a course northwest, 315, to recover their planes, which they did from about 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock. They had all their planes recovered then. Now, that is when the flyers wanted to convince Naguma to go back and let them bomb the ship repair and the POL. And I told you what could have happened. Another thing, when Naguma wouldn't do it, the book says that he was the type of officer that he'd been instructed to do this, and that was all he's going to do. He's going to head for home. And they had left their tankers about part of the way, on the way back, so that was one of the things that they had to be concerned about. And then the flight officers tried to talk Naguma into taking the task force south of Oahu and try to intercept any carriers that are coming in. We had the 2 carriers that were on their way back from Wake and Midway, and they had hoped to intercept them and sink them too. Now, those carriers had been reported by the people in the consulate, so that's how they knew that the carriers were around there someplace, but they weren't in the harbor. And if they had been able to find those carriers, they were operating singly, and so that would be the 6 carriers of the Japanese fleet against each of our separate carriers. And that would have wiped out those carriers, of course, because they just overcome. And so that was the situation there. Now, when we got back to the coast, one of the people in the rear sighted a single-engine carrier plane, and I was flying at about 1,000. So I dove for the deck because I didn't want to let him get under me, and also that would give the people with the guns a chance to shoot out the side windows. But it turned out that he was another search plane. Other officers in our squadron had been ordered to search close around, which they did, and that was one of the planes that did that. And so I just reported that I hadn't seen anything, and sat in the hangar, the ready room, ready to go out again in case he called me. For about the 6 months after that attack, we didn't know whether or not they were coming back. So we were being very cautious about everything. We were given orders to drop depth bombs on any submarines that were in areas that they shouldn't be, but we never saw any. Originally, I didn't have any depth bombs on the plane, but when that order came out, they put some on. But I never saw any subs, so that wasn't necessary to do that. Now, one of the things that happened is that when they had the congressional investigations, there was about 10 of them. And I told you about what General Marshall had said. And they blamed CINCPAC, Admiral Kimmel, and General Short. The investigations committee proved that there was more to it than that. But no one else was blamed until the final committee came up, and they blamed the president because the president had a message that had been broken from the embassy on December 6th. And that message had 14 parts, and the 14th part explained that Japan was breaking off relations with America. And so the president sat down and dictated a letter to his secretary to the effect, he sent it to via the Ambassador Grew in Japan, to the effect that he and the Emperor Hirohito should not carry this on into a war because so many people will be killed. And that message was delivered by Ambassador Grew about 20 minutes before the first bomb dropped on Pearl Harbor. So that was a waste of time, but at least he tried. But he was still blamed for not acting. And one of the things that happened, he got that message at 9:30 on December 6th in the evening. Harry Hopkins was there visiting with him. And he turned to Harry Hopkins, he says, "This means we're going to war." And he was going to call the CNO out of a show that he knew he was attending, and he didn't do that. He said, oh, well, I'll just talk with him tomorrow morning at the Pentagon. So they met over at the Pentagon the following morning. They had to look for the general marshal for a while because he was out riding his horse, but about 11 o'clock they located him and got him over to the Pentagon. And the first thing they do, they explain the situation that Kimmel and Short faced out there. There was still time to get a message there. But come to find out, the atmospherics were so bad that they couldn't send out CW. And so, you know what they did? They sent out a commercial message. Kimmel got it Monday noon because the commercial office wasn't open on Sunday. But that was one of the big mistakes that all of those educated people in Washington, and they went through this process and didn't know that. And it was just one thing after another that was happening that it just didn't look good for anybody. And Kimmel was blamed and Short was blamed. And Kimmel was relieved by Nimitz on the 17th. I saw him come to Pearl Harbor. He came in a 4-engine plane. I saw him get off and report in. And he was an excellent officer. And he was the man in charge of SINCPAC for the rest of the time. And he did a terrific job. And that's about all I have to say now. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer anything I can.
What day of the week was December 7th? Sunday?
December 7th, Sunday, yes. Well, thank you very much for coming.
I'd like to make a comment. My family was visiting
Okay.
D.C. and we were walking down where these statues of Roosevelt in his 3 terms in office, and each term had a famous quote that he was used to say. So I told the guard, I said, well, I don't see the quote that whenever I think of Roosevelt, I think of. He said, well, what's that? And I said, this day will live in infamy. And he says, well, they didn't put that down because they don't want to offend anybody. And I said, heck, I'm still mad. So they don't have that quote, and that's one I think he's most famous for.
Yeah. I had an interview by my university from South Dakota. I came from South Dakota yesterday, and they asked me questions, and I told them a story over the telephone. And I asked him what they're going to do with it. Well, he says, I'm in communications here at the university, and we're going to broadcast it in South Dakota and Minnesota tomorrow. So a lot of people probably heard that. Yes?
What does POL stand for? You mentioned
Oil. The petroleum oil. Yeah. And we had several containers of stacks up on the hill on the other side of Ford Island. They were across the way, well, across Pearl Harbor from them. Yes. Yes.
Did we have any fighter aircraft there in Hawaii at that time?
We had some P-40s. Incidentally, let me tell you about that, too. Before the war started, Washington had sent out information to be very careful of people coming in damaging anything. And so what did General Short do out of Wheeler Field? He put all of his P-40 pursuit planes in one spot, removed the ammunition, and removed the guns. So when the Japanese came over, they flew in over that area, and there was the most beautiful target you ever saw. Some of the pilots had their aircraft over at Ewa, which is another base about 10 miles away, so they drove over there, and they got in their P-40s, and there was some other planes up to P-40s from there, and they shot down a total of 29 Jap planes. And so that was an interesting venture there. But the Washington really didn't have a feeling for what was happening to us out in Pearl Harbor, to tell us to put all of our planes together, of all things. And here they were all blown up. So I told you about the bomber base near Pearl Harbor that was attacked also, and they destroyed everything they could there. The 12 B-17s that did come in, some of those were shot down, some of them had to land and damaged, and one or two was good. But that was the situation with them. Well, thank you very much for coming.